Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for our Fireside chat follow-up on our measures chat from a couple weeks ago. Today, we're going to be going over topped-out measures and what you need to know for Mips reporting. We're here today with Lauren Patrick. We have Tara Kalra, Josh Hall, and Kelly Healy. And we will be walking you through each of each topic, and we will ask you to give us your questions. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see a question section. Please ask your questions, and if we have time at the end, we will get to them. As well as I've provided two handouts. One, a little self-promotion of our product Mips Pro, and the other is the short slide deck that we'll be going through today. So please ask away your questions. Otherwise, the recording and slides will be sent to you at the end of this call for your future use. So without further ado, I just wanted to share this information. For more information on us here at Healthmonix, you can reach out to us at contact@healthmonix.com or the phone number below. Otherwise, I'm ready to turn this over to Miss Lauren Patrick.
Oh, I thought maybe you were going to have a poll or something.
Oh, I forgot about the polls. Hold on. Okay, let's do the polls first. I have two quick polls for everybody. So let's launch the first poll. The first poll is asking you, what is your understanding of Mips quality measures? This is to give us a better understanding of how you are doing this year and where this conversation needs to go. All right, great participation rate. Another 5 seconds I'll give everybody. Great, thank you very much. So this is showing we are actually pretty widespread across the board for this poll. So you can see here that we have people everywhere from expert to novice. So appreciate your response. The next poll, and this is it, and then we'll get you over to Lauren, is what is your role within your organization? Great, thank you very much. Another couple seconds and I'll end this as well. And then we will get a move on. Great, thank you very much for your responses. It looks like we have a lot of managers on board with us today, as well as people that are in charge of their quality. So thank you very much for participating. And now I am going to throw it over to Lauren to start us off.
We have to figure out how to do the pineapple thing, Mike, so you can throw me the pineapple and I can catch it. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to dig into a tricky subject of measure scoring in the quality section of Mips. So when PQRS started, the way you would get a score for a measure wasn't necessarily, well, in the beginning for PQRI, I'm thinking back, I think, and Josh, help me, you're the only one here, I think, that's been with me long enough to remember PQRI days. Didn't you you got points for just submitting, right? Like if you submitted.
Yeah, basically, at that point in time, they just wanted people to do it. So
yeah.
They're like, you did it? Great, thanks for your data. You get all these points, you win.
So then was it with Mips? I'm trying to think back that the actual performance deciles and scoring based on actual performance started?
Yeah, it started around Mips. So after PQRI, there's PQRS. Even at that point, they were pushing for more like measures groups, trying to get groups of measures, starting to make not just give us your data, but here are ways to make giving us your data easier. And eventually we get into Mips, and they're like, okay, people are getting in this process. They're starting to refine the process, and with Mips, they really started stratifying, creating these deciles. And they could only start creating these deciles because of all the data they had historically.
So talk a little bit about deciles. I know this is your wheelhouse and Tara's wheelhouse. You guys work continuously year round on getting our measures implemented and then making sure that we're scoring them correctly. So talk a little bit about what these deciles are and kind of how they get set up.
Yeah, so every decile is, well, really, if we think about it, CMS is acquiring all this data from every single year. It gets more and more, I guess, fruitful, or they get more to go off of. They're creating these data models, and off of these data models, they can say, okay, we know that just like if you were taking a test with a bunch of people for a class, they can start stratifying and seeing, okay, what is the expected performance for a particular measure. And they might say, well, the average that everyone's getting is a 60%, or the average is a 70%, or an 80%. And they can kind of create this decile, and every decile is split into 10, might be certain ranges. So if you fall into the 8th decile, it might be a little different for one measure compared to another if that decile was, say, in the 90th percentile or the 50th percentile. So when you're looking at a measure, some measures people are naturally completing and performing better on. They're getting more met instances. So they might be in a higher decile, they might be in the 80 or 90 percentile range. And the deciles might be more bunched up in the 70th and 80th and 90th percentile range because more people are meeting that measure. Other measures that naturally people aren't performing as well on, the deciles might be more balanced. So you might have a decile 6, which is between the 50th and 70th, and you might have a decile 4 that's between 40 and 50, and it's just more evenly divided between everything. So that's kind of how I approach it a little bit. And it's kind of a treating deciles like both from a machine learning, what do we expect people to get, and also when you're doing it, being like, oh, what's my goal for each measure?
Tara, you have anything to add to that?
So I was thinking a little bit, so what Josh is talking about is like the concepts of the deciles and how we do the benchmarking based off it. From more of a measures perspective, where some measures have strata, different stratas, the question is also how do we create benchmarks for multiple strata measures? And it can be done in two different ways, where one way is that they'll average it. They'll average the denominators, average the numerators, and then figure out the algorithm based on that. So it's almost like a weighted benchmark. Or there are other measures that have, it's almost called like a default or a primary strata, which is the one that that CMS is more interested in. And so they really care about the performance based on that one strata.
So an example of the latter is smoking cessation, one of our most popular measures, measure 226. Can you talk a little bit about how that works in terms of benchmarking, and then we'll kind of move into the topped out versions of those?
Sure. So 226, it's got 3 different stratas. The first strata is looking for if you're screened and identified as a tobacco user, screened not identified as a tobacco user, and then there are different permutations. Strata 2 is really what CMS is interested in, and that's the cessation and intervention. While we need to know the status of your smoking in order to get to that second strata, it's what strata 2 is what CMS really wants. So that's what we're going to report on. The third strata is really merging the first 2 strata into an aggregated strata, where we look at if you are a user, did you have cessation and intervention, and the different permutations there. that gives a provider a little bit more of an understanding of their patient population and where they really need to focus in on what sort of tobacco users they need to have more intervention and cessation with. But CMS is looking for whether the cessation and intervention is really being provided for those that require it. So that's a default strata. So that's the middle strata for that one.
Right, and I think they changed that, didn't they? Like the first year or two, I think, of Mips, they used that third strata, which was kind of the combo. But then CMS said, well, we're really, okay, now that we got to thinking about this stuff, what we're really interested in is the outcome, which is strata 2, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that kind of goes along, I think, with the whole mentality of CMS from the perspective of, we started out with a lot of process measures, but what we're really interested in is looking at things that improve patient health. And we know that there's certain processes that will improve patient health, but really now that we've got people thinking about that, we want to take the next step and look at outcomes. You know, is it really improving our patient population's health? And so I think that's why CMS is narrowing the use of a lot of process measures. You'll see them dropping off. I mean, 2020, we had a lot less. I think if you look at the proposed rule for 2021, there's even fewer process measures. So they're really they're tapering off those process measures and really hoping that people start focusing on the outcomes. One of the things that's happening with, I'm sorry, I'm blathering here. Would you guys like to?
No, I mean, that's good because like, that's
Yeah.
the whole point is, and that kind of reflects also what we were talking about peak your eye at the beginning. You know, the easiest thing to measure is, did you do the thing? So that's a process measure. And we want to keep moving towards outcomes. Like, sure, sometimes all that matters is whether you did the thing, whether you treated a patient a certain way, and you know, we're considering that a met, but the outcome is what's important. The reason we're doing this is to give patients better care. So, and that, you know, leads into all this benchmarking. You know, you're going to start getting graded not just on whether you're doing the thing you ought to do as a doctor, but more so, is the patient getting better? Is the care providing them with better care, better cost, everything that can go into an outcome measure.
Great. So let's move on to something where we get a little more interesting. And that is, Josh, as you were talking about deciles, what's happening is CMS takes all of the data from, I think, 2 years before. So like in 2020, they're looking at all of the 2018 data because they take it all in and they calculate the deciles. So for the lowest 10% of providers, here's their range of scores. For the next 10%, here's their range of scores, et cetera, all the way up to the top. And what they're finding is that people are, in fact, moving up the scale. So we are getting better. So that's led to topped-out measures. So can you talk a little bit about topped-out measures and kind of, I don't know if we want to put up our little scenario yet, or if you guys want to give a little bit more background?
Yeah, so this is a nice slide that kind of shows how a measure goes from being introduced, not topped out, and then all the way towards being extremely topped out. So when a measure is introduced, we have little data on it or no data at all. It gets approved. So you can see that for measure 39, a non-topped out measure, its deciles are pretty evenly distributed. So when we're looking from left to right there, where it says 0.28 to 3 and all the way up, those are deciles moving up from base decile range to higher up in the deciles, like 9 and 10. And as you go down, you know, some deciles are still not topped up, but they have higher performance. So like measure 226. And then as people are getting better and meeting the measure more and more, and as CMS looks at the data and they're saying, okay, more and more people are meeting the measure 95, 96, 97% of the time, they're going to say a measure is topped out, which in essence means, hey, in order to get all of your points for this measure, you're basically going to need to ace it. Isn't that right, Lauren?
Yep, you have to have every single patient in compliance with the measure. Or
Right.
not in compliance if it's an inverse measure. But yeah.
Yeah. And if you think about that, that's kind of crazy that a measure would even get to a point where in order to get the max amount of points, you literally can't have one person that doesn't meet the measure. So how could measures get to this point where they're so topped out? Do you have any input in that, Lauren or Tara?
Oh, sorry.
How could a measure get to the point where it's so topped out that you literally need to ace the measure to get full points for it?
So I think part of it is the fact that some people, that you don't have to report all of your patients either, right? You're providing a 70% sample of your patients. So I think that in some cases, maybe it's skewed from that perspective. But in some cases, it gets to the point where if it's a process measure in particular, you can really get to the point where you're at 100%. And it's, you know, it's really, if somebody is totally focused on that, they can do that. But they're definitely, I mean, it's good to have 100% performance. But then what happens is they become topped out. And then, as you can see, as Josh is pointing out, it gets really hard to get that 10 points. In the case of measure 226, as you can see, to get the 10 points, you'd have to be at 100%. If you have one patient not in compliance, you're back down to decile, I think it's decile 8, maybe.
Right, for that's a 374, the topped out one.
Oh, you're right, you're right.
Right. And like you said, it's a good thing, right, that people are doing this every time, that you're getting to 100%. And that means the measure is doing what it ought to do, right? You're actually changing your practice based off of these guidelines. So in a sense, measures being topped out is big. This measure is working so well that eventually we're not going to need the measure anymore. That's kind of the idea behind it. Before that even happens, though, you can see stage 4. So if a measure is about to, you know, walk off into the sunset, measure becomes extremely topped out, which is to say, even if you ace this measure, you're only going to get 7 points, not 10. So they're saying, you know what, we're going to have this measure available. We understand that a lot of people might need it, but you're not going to be able to get 10 points for it, even if you're doing it every time. And that would be a case for measure 130, where documenting current medications on, and that's something that's like, well, you know, the layman would think, of course that's going to happen every time. And as you can see from the deciles, yes, it happens nearly every time for most practices. And that's great, the measure worked out. But hey, you can't get 10 points for it though in Mips anymore, even if you do it every time.
So isn't there a 4-year life cycle that a measure typically goes through when it gets topped out? Tara, you're nodding your head. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm gonna make a side note. I'm sorry, my lawn guys are outside, and so that's the noise from my side. So that's why I keep unmuting and muting myself. So apologies from my end.
Going on here, yeah.
So the journey of a measure, you can see there's 4 stages here, and it really can be like broken into like years. Stage 1 and stage 2 is basically where you're getting to this, place of being topped out. You can stay in a topped out stage for 2 years, and that's where you can make your 10 points, and you need to get your 100% of your cases to be met. The 3rd year is where you're going to become extremely topped out, which is where you can, even if you do make your 100%, you're only going to get 7 points max. 4th year is really when they're going to start retiring. They're going to retire the measures because it's no longer helping them understand a patient care in a way that's necessary, that we need to do data submission on.
So can a high priority measure get topped out?
Right, so Josh, I'm gonna let you take that one because you're a little bit more eloquent with that response.
Pretty sure it can, right? Because like, even if it's high priority means everyone's going to focus on it. And if everyone's going to focus on it, you're going to get more data for it, and then people will be doing it. So yeah, I believe high priority ones can get topped out. Correct, Warren? Yeah. Just because it's high priority doesn't mean that the data that we're getting for it will look different than something else. In a sense, I would almost probably want high priority measures to be topped out. That means people are focusing on it.
Great. I don't know who put the slide up. Can we go back a couple slides? Mike, perhaps? What's your next slide? Oh. I'd like to talk a little bit about the different measure reporting types, submission types. So here we go. So CMS creates benchmarks for each type, for each submission type that we have. They'll create a separate benchmark for claims reported measures versus Mips CQMs versus eCQMs. So as you can see here on this chart, we're looking at measure 226. And I believe this is 2020 data. And what you'll see on here is that the benchmarks vary widely between the three measures. So Tara and Josh, can you comment a little bit on this and why they're different and what this means?
So they're going to be different because the type of data that we receive for these different types of reporting types have a different type of strength to them. And the amount of data that we do receive is going to be different. The amount of data that we receive is going to be different based on, since benchmarks are based off of the data that we currently have in hand, that's going to shift what our benchmarks are.
So it's interesting to me that it looks like the eCQM, it's easier to achieve a higher performance than perhaps for the registry version of the measure or the Part B claims forms.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think the reasoning behind that is due to eCQMs being end-to-end reporting. There is a human element to this where, if you're using a registry, you're going to be wanting to choose, and we help you choose the measures that you're doing best on. If you're using eCQM measures, you're using EHR, you're using something like us where you're just bringing in the data and it's being submitted, you can't you can't touch that data. So the data that they're getting, in a sense, is a little bit more true to form. And because of that, the benchmarks are a little easier to hit.
Interesting. So is this true across the board that eCQMs tend to have a better chance of getting a higher score if you're using eCQMs?
Yeah, in general, this is just an example for 226, but more often than not, you'll see less of a steep curve for eCQMs. It's more of a gradual curve, such that there's not quite so much this bunching that you might see in a Mips measure or registry version compared to the eCQM version at the top of the deciles.
So my understanding is another outcome of some of these measures and the fact that our providers are doing well at achieving the measure benchmarks is that for some of the intermediate outcome measures, we were seeing that it was getting really, really hard to get in that best decile. So CMS developed something called flat benchmarks for those. Can you talk a little bit about those? And I think there might be a slide to show that as well.
Sure, and this is new for this year, for 2020. So if we look at benchmarks for measures 1 and 236 here, both of these are outcome measures. You're monitoring whether someone for diabetes has a low A1C, and then you're controlling high blood pressure, see what people's blood pressure is. And as you can see, every decile is just going up by 10 points. So rather than using a model for the amount of data and doing the standard decile ranges, they decided to just say, hey, we're going to split it up this way. And the reason for this is that for certain cases, despite for an outcome measure, A1C being low being the best outcome, there are numerous instances where we don't want to, CMS doesn't want to ding a provider if they're properly treating a patient because they might have other conditions. So something I believe we talked about before, Lauren, was if you have other conditions or other diagnoses such as CKD or other reasons, there might be something more important for the provider to focus on in that visit rather than just if their A1C is less than 9. And for that reason, CMS is like, hey, we're just going to have these standard deciles across the board such that people aren't kind of laser focused on, you know, hitting decile 10 100% of the time.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to note. I mean, we're incentivizing providers monetarily, and we don't want to incentivize them to do the wrong thing for their patients. And so this makes a lot of sense for the intermediate outcome measures that are in the system where we're seeing performance very, very much increasing. So we may see more of these in the future as we go forward.
Right.
Any other comments on top-down measures that you guys want to focus on at this point?
I think one thing that we can sort of highlight is that while topped out measures, they're getting topped out because they're because it's easy to get to the 10th decile. Sometimes it's better for us, for a user to select a harder measure or a more complex measure, and they don't have to perform as well in order to obtain that 10 points or 7 points or whatever the allowable points are for that measure. So it shouldn't always be that you're trying to find the best. You need to be finding the best measures for you, but that doesn't always mean that they're the easiest measures.
That's a good point. And
Right.
they should be relevant to your practice as well.
Absolutely.
So in terms of top-down measures, what we're seeing is more and more of our measures are hitting these. So CMS is certainly getting what they've asked for, which is increased performance on these measures. And I think we have a slide, that's somebody's cue to put up a slide to show kind of the distribution of measures being not topped out, and extremely topped out. Extremely topped out are the ones with the 7-point caps. So you can see here that so many of our measures are becoming topped out or extremely topped out. So measures with no benchmark, what are those? Do you guys, can you comment on those?
Yeah, a measure without a benchmark, CMS hasn't yet acquired enough data to accurately assign benchmarks for a measure. So rather than put up faulty benchmarks, they decided, no, we're not going to have any benchmarks for this year.
So for a measure that has no benchmark that's pre-defined by CMS, they can still get a score at the end of the year, right? If enough data comes in?
Yeah, I believe that it's, you can get points for, there's different types of bonus points that you can get, and there's points there are some criteria that you have to meet in order to get those points. Percentage of submission of your patients and a few other criteria.
So my understanding is at the end of the year, CMS, if there's at least a sufficient number of providers that submit the data, and they each have enough cases, at least 20 cases, that CMS will go ahead and compute those benchmarks for the year, and they'll retroactively assign those benchmarks for those. So you can submit a measure that has no benchmark, but what will happen is at the end of the year, if there are enough cases, you might get a score greater than 3 for that. But you can see here that if you look at, for example, CQMs, that less than 50% of the measures have benchmarks that are not topped out. So I think it's becoming more and more a scenario where you really need to look at the measures that you're going to submit and think about, are you willing to submit the topped out measures? Are there non-topped out measures that can be submitted? Do you want to try to submit measures with that currently have no benchmarks? So at this point, I'm going to ask Kelly, who's one of our large account managers, to kind of talk a little bit about this. Like, how do we decide if you're working with providers regarding selecting measures, and the measures that they've been using, say, for the last year or two, start getting topped out or have a 7-point cap? Talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we can use to help them still achieve a good score in the Mips program.
Sure. So, especially with the larger clients that I'm working with, you know, they're always planning for the future, and I with them. So when we encounter one of these measures and they are in the topped out, you know, with these benchmarks, and we're finding that it is very difficult for them to be hitting these benchmarks and getting a realistic score, you know, we start to look elsewhere for backup measures. So I always say, you know, don't just be measuring 6 measures. You're going to want to have at least 7 or 8, depending on how many topped out measures they have. You know, based on that chart, you can see there are a lot of topped out measures. And we know from the other slide that, you know, with the life cycle of these measures, if it's topped out or extremely topped out, we know that measure is nearing retirement, and that measure is going to disappear. And if you're only measuring 6 measures, the next year you might only have 5 measures, and that's not a position you want to be in. So especially this time of year, you know, with the last quarter, it's a great time to start implementing a new measure, get your providers used to a new measure and start implementing it before the new year so that you have that measure for the full year for 2021, for example. So they have some time to get used to it, get it in their routine, and, you know, have that. And you can start inputting that data even in 2020 and start seeing what that looks like. You know, even though you're not going to have a full year's worth of data, you can start to see what those benchmarks look like, what that data looks like in the system. It's just a good idea. So even if you don't yet have that full year's worth of data, it's still worth putting in the system, seeing what that looks like, making sure it's not, you know, topped out. And maybe, depending on the type of measure, you might be able to get a full year's worth of data. And if it's a high priority measure or something like that, you could get some bonus points associated with it. Or if it's an outcome measure, you know, so these are the things that we weigh. Every specialty is different. Some specialties have it really tough with the amount of measures that are assigned to them, you know, what's available. So it's a conversation you have with our customer service, but thankfully we're really good at that.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah,
so
you're
there
welcome.
are 2 questions in my mind. One is, sorry to hog the screen here, but
You're good.
one is, so I heard that in 2021, in the proposed rule, CMS has suggested not giving us any benchmarks for it due to COVID. Josh and Tara, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that, as we mentioned with the measures that had no benchmarks, and one of the things that's important for data integrity in general, creating data models, is if we, CMS, as in we, if CMS doesn't have the data for 2019, 2020, to create accurate benchmarks for 2021, they're gonna be like, hey, you know what? We don't have good data to provide for these measures, accurate data. And, we're gonna leave it to, I believe, Lauren, the registries and different people to kind of create benchmarks on our own, right? To provide people with areas where they can try to meet for each measure, create deciles. Is that true?
Well, so certainly we could provide deciles based on the data we have. The problem is what CMS is seeing is that the data for 2019, because of the public health emergency, they didn't get as much data as they normally would. So they're fearful that it's not statistically significant, and you guys know better about that than I do, but B, it's potentially also skewed based on the kinds of providers that did report. So depending on your circumstances, depending on the area of the country you are in, depending on your specialty, there's a lot of variation in who was able to finish their reporting and submit it. So I think that we're fearful that the data from 2019, which is what normally would be used for 2021 benchmarks, will be skewed. So they really don't want to use that. On the other hand, to your point, Josh, that kind of leaves it as a blank slate in terms of providers wondering how they're going to do. You're submitting data and fingers crossed you're going to get a high score. So one of the things that we're thinking about is, should a registry such as us provide benchmarks based on the data that we're accumulating throughout the year? Now that's got its own issues as well, right? Because we collect data from certain populations of providers, and maybe we don't get, for example, folks that are in big hospitals that use Epic only. They don't necessarily use a registry as much as other folks. So the data could be skewed. So it really is. So I caution folks to really pay attention to that for 2021, because we may have no benchmarks from CMS at the beginning of the year, and that's kind of going to change up how we go forward. The other thing, Kelly, sorry, I get on a topic and I just want to talk. The other thing, Kelly, you mentioned is bonus points. So I know that we're saying for some of these measures, you can only get 10 points or you can only get 7 points if they're topped out. So talk about some of the ways you can accommodate that in terms of perhaps other points you can get to kind of bring you back up to that full, to make you whole.
Absolutely. So what we want to do, if you are, let's say, due to your specialty or what have you, stuck with a measure that's extremely topped out and capped at 7 points, what I would recommend to somebody is focusing on getting other measures that are high priority and or outcome. If you report additional outcome measures, like you already have an outcome measure and then you're reporting extra outcome measures, you're going to get 2 bonus points for every additional outcome measure you report, or for high priority measures, that's worth 1 extra bonus point. Now that is capped at 10% of your score, so you can't endlessly get bonus points. There is a cap on bonus points, but if you are seeking out measures that are high priority and outcome, you are going to potentially be able to close that gap, or at least help out the deficiency that you are having with that extremely topped out measure or any other topped out measures by having those bonus points. And I have seen, some of my groups still get a perfect score even with a highly topped out measure because of, having those other measures like that.
And also the end-to-end bonus, right? if you're reporting
Yes.
CQMs?
Yes, if you are if you work with one of our partners and you get the end-to-end cert bonus, so you are not having any kind of human interaction and we're getting that data straight from your EHR and your EHR is certified, you're going to get a bonus for every 1 point bonus for every measure, and that is also capped at 10%. But of course, you just get 1 bonus point for every measure, and that helps a lot.
So I
So,
could get one bonus measure, I could get 1 bonus point for every measure for end to end, and then I could
mhm.
get up to 6 or 7 bonus points for my high priority or top down high priority or outcome measures, right?
Correct. Yeah, depending on your situation.
Okay. And then if you're a small practice, does that go into your quality score or does that get added somewhere else?
That is your quality score. So that's not going to be, I believe in 2017, that was just added to the overall Mips score. Uh, Maybe even in 2018 too. No, I think in 2018 and 2019, they started just adding it to the quality score. So you get 6 small practice points added to your quality score. So that's really great for small practices. Then I think, CMS heard the cries of small practices about how hard this is for them because they don't always have the resources to have a dedicated quality person. So they need that extra assistance.
Right.
And that 10%, like the maximum amount of points you can get from bonus points, is that a 10% for like each type or just 10% total?
Each type. So you
So I
get the
can get
cert
like a
bonus.
10% for ECQM and I can get a 10% for outcome and high priority. I can get more for small practice. So it can really add up, right?
Yeah. So if having the topped out measures is not the end of the world if you know how to strategize. So for some folks, it's about the strategy, it's about knowing these rules. And I think a lot of folks don't always know these rules and know all these little things that come up, and they just pick these measures and they don't look at benchmarks, they don't look at the score, and then they just put in their data and they're like, why are my points so bad? So that's why it's so good to attend these webinars and learn all these little nuances,
Great.
or talk to customer service and then we teach you.
So I don't know if there's any questions from the audience or
I
There
do.
is, Lauren. There's plenty of questions from the audience here, and I can help you guys out. I can help you guys out and ask some. You actually answered a lot of these questions in the last 10, 15 minutes of the presentation. So the first one I have here that I'd like to ask is, we're still waiting on the 2021 final rule to be published to determine if 2020 quality benchmarks will be based off historical data versus current year reporting, right? So we discussed that part, but the follow-up question to that is, if QPP decides to use current performance data for 2020 benchmarks due to COVID, they will be determining if measures are topped out or extremely topped out for the current year, which may or may not affect the 7-point score cap, correct?
yes.
And we'll find that out end of November, probably.
Well, we'll find out how they're going to proceed the end of November. That's typically when they publish the final rule.
Mhm.
And then the benchmarks typically come out in January. Help me out, Josh.
Yeah, they typically come out mid to end December.
Okay, the benchmarks do?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, great. With removing of the process measures, how does a very limited practice find measures to meet standards? This instance, this provider is asking, or this guest is asking, we have a nurse practitioner that works in nursing homes only. and they provide psych and med management for their patients. How does someone find 6 measures and try to fight against the topped-out measures in this case? I'm going to go
Kelly,
Kelly
you
for
think
that
you
one.
could go with that?
So for someone like this, I would say, especially with nursing homes, I do work with a group that has a similar situation. And I know with the nursing homes, there's usually very limited CPT codes associated with that. So normally that's a conversation that we probably want to get a little bit more information about, like what CPT codes are you billing, so we can make sure that like you're getting the right measures. Because I know when I talked with one of my larger clients, same situation, they do struggle with that as well. I do know that our APA partner has recently made some changes to their QCDR measures to make sure that those are available for nursing home. But we got to make sure that that also applies for you. But that being said, since those are QCDR measures, they probably don't have benchmarks. So, but they are outcome measures, so they get 2 bonus points. So there's that little back and forth there. So that's something to keep in mind, because then if you report those, the more people we get reporting those, benchmarks could be created. So it's something to think of for the future. But I'd say reach out to us, and we, so maybe Mike, you can connect me or someone in customer service with this person, and we can do a little bit more research.
What about Emma? How does Emma factor into that?
So with Emma, whenever somebody has less than 6 measures, CMS is supposed to look at their claims and see what they are, what they could have reported, and if they couldn't report more than 6 measures, and like let's say they only reported 5, and CMS looks at their claims and said, yeah, they could only report those 5 measures, they'll reduce the denominator of 60 points within quality to 50, and then you'll be scored just on those 5 measures, as if out of a denominator of 50 instead of a denominator of 60. If they find that you reported 5 measures but you should have reported 6, they're going to keep that denominator out of 60. So you'll still be scored just fine, but you will also, it'll be as if you were missing a measure. So your score will suffer for that, but you'll still do fine. You're not going to fail. You just won't get as high of a score as you could have with the EMA process. What we have found, though, for a lot of folks, just in my experience, if they need to go through the EMA process, they often have to file a targeted review. Seems like CMS has not been following their own EMA rules, and you have to write them about it, just have a lot of documentation and conversations with them about it, just to back up your point, and then remind them in the targeted review season. So it is a little bit of a pain, but
But we've been through it.
We've been through it, and we can help you. So that is part of what you get with Mips Pro, is experience and assistance with that fun process.
So this is that's a great answer, and thank you from the sales team.
You can just see the experience in Kelly's face. It's like we've been there.
All right.
I just finished up on October 5th.
Yeah.
We have a common theme across a number of questions here. But what what about the difference between these measures that are now topped out, and as we move towards measures that aren't topped out, they're so much harder, everybody's saying, and they're tougher to get. What's your recommendation moving forward on how do you implement measures like this today?
I mean, the first thing to keep in mind, and I'm doing a test analogy. If they're hard for everyone. The reason they're harder is, a lot of the time now that we deal with our own measures, right? We're QCDR, we create measures, we work with organizations to create measures. Measures are complicated because now that everyone's like, oh, I want to create this measure, they want to put every little piece of data to track in the measure. And they don't quite think about the person who's going to eventually have to try to get this data. They just like, this is the data we want. And by the way, there's 7 strata, and by the way, there's 20 eligibility criteria. And you're just like, how in the world? So it's a little overwhelming, but everyone's in the same boat. And in the end, the whole point of these benchmarks is that, everyone's going to be graded on the average and of how people are doing. So, after the first couple of years of getting this data, it might be difficult. It might be difficult to start tracking it, to record it. But over time, you're not going to be doing any worse than you normally would, because other people are also dealing with that kind of learning curve, so to speak. So that's kind of, for me, as a measure developer, and also as someone who's guiding special organizations to create measures for QCDR measures and such, what we try to focus on them is being like, okay, 1, is this accurate? But 2, don't create too much of a burden on the provider to create these measures, with the understanding that if they are, receptive to learning the measures, and if they get into the habit of doing them, that they'll actually be fruitful. So that's kind of how I kind of deal with that a little bit. What about you, Tara?
Yeah, I actually agree with you completely. I think it's kind of like going back to what I was saying before, where they are more difficult. They're more difficult for everyone, and so you don't have to get the 100% meet at 100% to get those points that you're looking for. If the mean performance is at 50 or 40 or 30%, then you're going to be graded according. It's all indexed. You guys are everyone's indexed against each other. So it's you guys are all in the same, everyone's in the same boat almost. And then you can, as things get a little bit more implementable within the practice, it'll move up slowly and slowly, and then it just becomes more part of your routine in the practice.
Great, thank you.
As Kelly said, if you start earlier, so start the year before you're going to report the measure, then you can start getting some practice. You can see who, maybe you can discern some of your better providers in terms of meeting the measure and learn from what they're doing and help those that are perhaps not doing as well on the measure, implement best practices. And that's what the measures are about, right? I mean, CMS is trying to vet measures that they feel make a difference, need improvement. And so if we're using this data to help people perform better, then they're meeting their intended nature.
We're identifying the gaps in care, and we're trying to fill them.
Yeah.
All right, I have time for 1, maybe 2 more questions. I really appreciate everybody's questions here. So here's a question that often comes up, asking about our favorite thing in the world. Can't you just pick out who your top 70% is and report that?
No. Next question.
CMS specifically frowns upon cherry picking.
There you go. It was actually asked twice during this after our conversation about needing 70%.
It's
and we wonder, I wonder how many people perhaps do that, but
that's why the benchmarks got the way they were.
but
R.
we are against that.
Yeah, that's why we also encourage end-to-end reporting. The
Right.
more that people are automating this and the more that you're working with an EHR, one, it helps implementation. You know, you have professionals, the EHR is taking care of that. All the data is already in the system, is doing it for you. And then you're taking out that element as well.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Okay, so I'm not going to ask any more questions. I am going to throw up our information about how to contact us, and I'm going to ask for parting thoughts from our four speakers today. So let's start off with Kelly. Give me a parting thought on topped out measures and where you think everything's going in the future.
I think that hopefully we'll get more measures to replace the topped out measures that keep on retiring, and that we only get more, that we get better outcome measures that are more relevant to practices and hopefully not so hard to implement as some of the questions implied. But you know, if you're having trouble understanding a message or a measure, ask us. We can help you understand it.
All right, and I'm going right down my screen. Josh, you're next.
Yeah, so the thing that I have to remind myself of when things get hard, complicated, new measures, it can be frustrating, even for us to try to figure out, implement, is to realize the goal. So the goal of this is that people are getting treated well, that, you know, the whole goal of this is quality care. So we're in the data constantly. We're looking at statistics, and sometimes it just looks like numbers, but these are real people that are being treated. You know, when we are making difficult decisions, interpretations from CMS, this is affecting way more than we can see on our screens. So try to keep that in mind as you're also doing this quality reporting, is that, you know, it's a lot of nitty gritty stuff. It's a lot of trying to get points here and there, and there's a lot of money on the line, but in the end, you know, are people getting treated well? Are people getting the care that they need? So that's what I always try to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Josh. All right, Tara, you're next.
I think that what's important also, absolutely, we are working to get to know our patient populations, to understand the care that they're getting, to understand where the care that they should be getting is lacking, and then we can provide better care. The other thing that I really feel is important is that we can help, providers can help their peers also. So if they're able to see that someone needs some help with their reporting or with their patient care, they're identifying some gaps in care there. It allows for a more of a community approach also, in addition to individual patient care. It's a patients deserve a continuum of care across different providers, and this allows you to understand your patients from start to finish across different types of different specialties and different areas, and so they just get a better understanding of their story.
Great, thank you very much. And I'll go to Lauren in 1 second, but I'll let her close it out. Thank you everybody for joining today. Our questions were incredible. There are a bunch that we did not get to, but I promise that I will have our team get me answers so I can get them over to you soon after this call today. There is a lot going on moving into 2021 with Mips reporting, and we are on top of it. So stay tuned to our Mips webinars, our blogs, and everything else that we are able to deliver to you here at Healthmonix. And we appreciate you being in attendance. So to leave us out on top, Lauren, Patrick.
So what I was going to say in answer to your question is we talk a lot about measure selection, but what's coming is the MVP program, the Mips Value Pathways, where we're going to go back to essentially things like measure groups, where CMS is going to prescribe a set of measures to report. So that's going to make it a little bit different in the future. When we look at 2022, I think there's going to be new ways to select measures. And so we'll need to pay attention to that as well as we go forward. And certainly as we learn more, we'll share that with folks and we'll help you prepare for that as well. But right now we're dealing with topped-out measures and how we're going to score measures in 2021 and how to pick measures that will maximize our incentives. But in 2022, it's going to change up once again. So stay tuned.
Great. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks. Bye.